Hello, BookTube. I neglected Boldly GoVember, the month-long November read-along created by Paperback Junkie, in which all you have to do is read one Star Trek book of any kind to qualify. I neglected Boldly GoVember during my extremely rare absence from the normal world of this little room. I left. I had a long, wonderful Thanksgiving holiday in Vermont. And neglected Boldly GoVember while I was there, which is kind of ironic, considering the number of Star Trek novels that were within easy reach while I was there. But you know, something I've been saying to people in email and texting and whatnot is that holidays are in part designed to recharge, to retrench, to get away from the daily routines, and something felt a little off. It felt a little even irresponsible for me to be in the middle of a genuine family Thanksgiving, to which I had been invited with my little bean, and still do, 5 videos a day. Something like that felt a little wrong about that. It was a very friendly, very organic, very accepting environment. Had I wanted to do that, I'm sure that I would have been able to. I just didn't want to. It felt like Thanksgiving. It felt like, take a step back, take a breath, have a break. That's what that long holiday, nobody in America anyway, works from Wednesday until Monday. That's what it's all about, I think. So I neglected Boldly GoVember for those days, but I'm going to continue with it now, full string, until November is over. I could, holidays notwithstanding, talk about Star Trek forever. Every detail, every character, every script, every show, every season, everything, every theme. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that to you all. I'm not going to punish you for tuning into Boldly GoVember. But where we left off with, unfortunately, Star Trek The Next Generation. An iteration of Star Trek that was done in the 1980s. It eventually had large amounts of money being poured into it, and is, in my opinion, an almost complete failure. In 7 full seasons of the show, you can pull together a list of maybe 6 episodes that capture anything like the spirit of Star Trek, or in any way good. And often the good episodes, the good ones on that list of 6, often a lot of the best episodes on that list are just really good hours of drama that have nothing to do with Star Trek. 2 episodes of The Next Generation, very pointedly, are good, you sense, mainly because they do a Thanksgiving. They pull themselves out of the continuity of Star Trek. And as a result, Star Trek The Next Generation fielded virtually nothing in the way of memorable novels. Most of the novels are just garbage, just complete garbage. Written by people who either don't know anything about Star Trek or were told by corporate and legal overlords to nix it with the details, Poindexter. Just turn this into a book. One way or another. For now, mostly we're going to leave Star Trek The Next Generation behind. One of the things that Star Trek The Next Generation did for Star Trek was to convince the money people, the producers, the suits, the lawyers at the studio that there was a viable property, a commercial property, in a TV version of Star Trek. They already had become aware of that with the success of the movies. Star Trek The Next Generation proved that you could have a Star Trek show, and that the special effects budget would not exceed the profit of the episodes. And if you can do that with Star Trek The Next Generation, you can do that with other things too. So the studio quickly decided to make other Star Trek shows. And one of those was Deep Space Nine. And I want to credit here the Birnbaums and also the higher-ups at the studio, that they, although they knew now that you could have a financially successful Star Trek TV show, they still decided not to play it safe. They still decided to push the boundaries of what they were doing. And Deep Space Nine, as you can tell from the title, is very different. It pushes the boundaries about as fundamentally as you can do it. Although the hour-long, what happens next episode structure of Star Trek and The Next Generation is preserved, it's moved to a space station, Terok Nor, a Cardassian space station in orbit over the planet Bajor, which the militaristic and evil Cardassian Empire had been running as a labor camp, basically the whole planet as a labor camp. And when the shifting tides of war move against the Cardassians, they have to leave Terrac Nor. They have to leave this space station that they've built over the planet. They have to leave the planet. They have to leave most of the sector. They are still a very viable and malevolent military entity, but they no longer control that part of their own territory, and the Federation does. So the Federation moves in and puts someone in charge of Terrac Nor. They rename it Deep Space Nine as a space station, and it's of Bajor is also liberated. There's a massive liberation movement that is now helped by Starfleet to succeed, and the reason why Starfleet is so interested in doing this and in taking over the space station is because very near to the planet Bajor there is a stable wormhole, a gigantic aperture in space-time that periodically opens and closes, and that does so regularly and safely. In other words, it's stable enough to permit ships to travel through it from the next quadrant of space over a vast amount of time in a fraction of the time it would take to travel through it, even at high warp. Which makes Bajor pretty important. And so the Federation take over Terrac Nor. They rename it Deep Space Nine, and they staff it. And that becomes the basis for the TV show Deep Space Nine, with a direct handover. Remember, when we talked about Star Trek The Next Generation, we mentioned there was a direct handover from the original show. Tough to do when you're talking about that much time elapsing between airing dates. But with The Next Generation, the handover in the first episode was Dr. McCoy, who's 137 years old, but still alive. The same person, same character, not a clone, same actor, DeForest Kelley. And he has a brief cameo in the first Star Trek The Next Generation episode. And that is kind of a passing of the torch. It's kind of a handing off. It became something of a tradition as much as it could be in Star Trek. There is an exception we'll see coming up in later Boldly GoVember episodes. But for now, in this Birnbaum family of products, the handover in Deep Space Nine is equally unconventional. The handovers in things like this are almost always optimistic. They're almost always designed as a passing of the torch. You pass the torch on to the next runner in the relay. You don't pass the torch on to torch a grade school. And in Deep Space Nine, that does not happen. In Deep Space Nine, the handoff is Jean-Luc Picard, the captain of the Enterprise D, whose relationship with Commander Sisko, Benjamin Sisko, who is taking over Deep Space Nine, is extremely tense for a very good reason. Because when Captain Picard was totally co-opted by an alien species called the Borg, and I mean totally, to the extent where they excised huge chunks of his own body and implanted cybernetic implants and accessed all of his memories, all of his tactical awareness, everything that he knew as a Starfleet captain was weaponized on behalf of the Borg, to allow them to carve apart huge parts of Starfleet at battles, one battle after another. And in one of those battles, where dozens of starships and hundreds of Starfleet personnel were murdered by the Borg, one of those battles featured Benjamin Sisko's wife, who died there. And Benjamin Sisko very naturally blames Captain Picard. Now, you might say that's not fair, because Picard was co-opted by the Borg. Okay, fine. I think the reason for a lot of Benjamin Sisko's ire at being anywhere near Jean-Luc Picard, is the same as mine, which is that there is absolutely no way in the world, any world, imaginary or otherwise, future or otherwise, Star Trek or otherwise, there's absolutely no way in the world that Jean-Luc Picard would have been allowed to be in Starfleet after his co-option. He is rescued from the Borg. 23rd century medicine, 24th century medicine is sufficient to remove the artificial parts that the Borg planted in him, and to, I guess, vat grow the parts that they removed. He was still butchered by the Borg, but when we see him after his ordeal, he doesn't have a mechanical eye anymore. He doesn't have a mechanical arm anymore. He's been restored to his biological self, but it doesn't matter, because he was co-opted by a nanotechnology that Starfleet does not understand. He was in communication with a Borg collective by a means that Starfleet does not understand. In other words, when you are taking those parts out of him, if you're a 23rd century Starfleet doctor, you cannot be sure you got it all. There is no possibility that Jean-Luc Picard would ever have been put in control of a starship again, much less the flagship of the Federation. So when Benjamin Sisko is resentful of him at the very first episode of Deep Space Nine, you can understand why. Yes, he's resentful that something in the shape of this man gave the Borg the information they needed to destroy everything that he loved. But he's also resentful of the fact that this guy is still a captain, outranks him, that he came right back to work. And I'm resentful of that as well. Fortunately, Captain Picard's presence in Deep Space Nine is moments only, and then it's over. And then we get a slightly more settled version of Commander Sisko finding his feet at Deep Space Nine. He has a Bajoran resistance officer as a high-ranking member of his own staff. He has an alien shapeshifter as in control of security on Deep Space Nine, and has had that position for a long time. So Benjamin Sisko is entering in. He's bringing his boy with him. His wife is dead, but his little boy, Jake, is his responsibility, and that begins the process by which Deep Space Nine breaks lots and lots of new ground, because Benjamin Sisko is largely an isolated figure. It turns out that one of his officers is a Trill named Jadzia Dax. And the Trill are a Star Trek species introduced on The Next Generation, where they're a humanoid species, but an elect percentage of their populace has symbionts, native life forms to Trill, that look like slugs. They're about that big, and they have them implanted in their innards. And the slugs are the implants are sentient on their own and live for centuries. They need a host. They need in order to be, a fully interactive part of Starfleet, they need the humanoid host. And Jadzia Dax was once Curzon Dax. The host is the same. The physical body ages and or dies or whatever. And Benjamin Sisko knew Curzon Dax. And when he meets the new host of the new body of that host, Jadzia Dax, who's a science officer, he refers to her throughout the series as old man, because they're old friends and yet not. And it's done really well, and the actress who plays Jadzia Dax does a fantastic job, so you're right on board. There's a human doctor who comes to the station in order to experience frontier medicine, but most of the vibrant parts of Deep Space Nine cast are people who aren't Starfleet. Kira Nerys, the Bajoran major who is now a big part of Sisko's operating team, is not a part of Starfleet. She was part of the Bajoran resistance. Odo, the shapeshifter, is not a part of Starfleet, nor is he any recognized species. There's a Ferengi who runs the shop on the promenade called Quark, and he's a major character because the show got a great actor to play him, someone that fans loved right away, and yet he's not part of Starfleet, and so on and so forth down the line. And that was a big conceptual difference with Deep Space Nine. And another one was that you're not going anywhere. The action takes place on board the space station. The Planet of the Week template that Star Trek, the original Star Trek and The Next Generation followed, is simulated only by the varying visitors who come to the station. But the station doesn't go anywhere. At least at first, that has a curiously static effect on the reading. Not in a bad way. But another big difference, of course, is that Sisko is not a captain when the show starts. Why does he need to be a captain if he doesn't have a vessel? And fans push back against that slightly. Fans of Deep Space Nine loved it right from the beginning. And a lot of those fans got what it was trying to do. It was trying to do a different kind of Star Trek. And a lot of fans got that. More fans than I thought got that. But they did push back a little. Just a bit. And a couple of them made very insightful comments about the very first time that we have a lead African-American on a Star Trek show. He's not a captain. That, as the 21st century would say, that's not a good look. And Deep Space Nine corrected it. Eventually, a few seasons in, they gave Deep Space Nine a new starship, not a ship of the line, but a different kind of starship, smaller, tougher, faster. And they promote Benjamin Sisko to captain, so that he can be the captain of that vessel. And boy, oh boy, that isn't the only change. As Deep Space Nine went on, the writers embraced the fact that what they are talking about here is the Federation, planetary politics on a broad scale. We're not out in the middle of nowhere in the galaxy encountering strange odd phenomenon that are isolated to our captain's logs and that don't affect anyone else. Instead, the writers decided, well, since we've got a stationary show, let's bring in more and more Federation history. Let's make Federation history. Let's tell Federation stories. I've always maintained that every incarnation of Star Trek, in addition to all of its strengths and weaknesses, also gives the viewer something, adds something signature to the Star Trek lore, to the Star Trek imaginary world. It's tough to pinpoint that with the original show because it introduced everything. It introduced the whole of the show. If I had to do it, I would say a particular template of Captain, and also the idea, the civilization, and the thoughts of the species Vulcans. And with the Next Generation, it introduced bureaucracy. It introduced the idea of the Federation as a working political entity. That's not particularly a good thing. That's kind of boring. But the Next Generation also gave us the Klingons, and vastly, infinitely improved, broadened, and complicated version of the Klingons. They were no longer just swarthy-faced bad guys like they were in the original show. Even the original show was starting to push that, but in the Next Generation, we get Commander Worf, who's a bridge officer. He's a full Klingon. He was raised by humans, but on Earth, but he's a full Klingon and a member of an ancient Klingon house. And he has all sorts of conflicting thoughts about what it means to be a Klingon, and through him, Next Generation gave us a lot of Klingon lore and Klingon history and developments in the Star Trek continuity, the present continuity of Klingons. It's my opinion that the thing that Deep Space Nine gives us is the Federation. Deep Space Nine gives us a sweep of what it's like for Federation, for the stuff that was happening back at home when Jim Kirk and his crew were out, at Cestus 3 fighting the Gorn or whatever. And eventually the writers of Deep Space Nine totally embraced that. And you started getting Federation history made on a broad scale. And that was a lot of fun. That drew in a lot of talent and was handled, I think, really well. And it presented challenges for the people who were writing Deep Space Nine books. There were obviously immediately Deep Space Nine novels. And some of the challenges, I think, were dropped. I don't think a great Deep Space Nine novel has ever been written, and boy, could it be. And the gimmick, the way that you would do it, is obvious. The writers served it up in the course of 7 years. That is Jake Sisko, Benjamin Sisko's son, grows up to be a journalist. He grows up to be a writer. He wants to be a writer. And he grew up on the station. Jake Sisko's book on Deep Space Nine would I think be the great Deep Space Nine novel, and no one's ever tried that. So, but every major character on the station had a role in raising Jake Sisko. That would be a fantastic book. It would certainly be a great vantage point for a Star Trek novel. But one way or another, the challenge for a lot of the writers of Deep Space Nine novels was specifically complicated by the fact that the Deep Space Nine writers for the show were telling just the kind of backspace filling in stories that novelization writers tend to want to gravitate to. And the writers for the show had the same obstacles, the same things that they wanted to do with the Next Generation. Because in Star Trek now, keep in mind, we mentioned before that now Star Trek has incorporated the passage of time into the mythos of Star Trek. Jean-Luc Picard and Ben Sisko live a century after Jim Kirk and Mr. Spock. Dr. McCoy might live the whole time, but it's a daunting amount of time. And a lot of stuff has happened in between then and there. 3 other Enterprises, for instance. But now, not only that is present for someone who wants to write a novel set in Star Trek and pitch it to the studio or take a job from the studio. Now it's not just time. Are you talking about the original Star Trek or the Next Generation? Now it's all these sideways iterations, because you have Deep Space Nine and all that it entails, all the stories that you could tell there, and that now are 6 different kinds of things that have to be traced and tracked and approved by 6 different authorities. The writers wanted to include as much of Star Trek as they could. This was once Deep Space Nine's sister show, Star Trek Voyager, launched. Then all of a sudden there were 4 Star Trek properties. 3 taking place relatively at the same time, 1 taking place a century later. How do you connect them all? Do you ever make a story that connects them all? We mentioned Red Sector, a series where there's a pathogen that is made and then goes dormant and then pops up again. That's a way to connect them all. There were a couple of other ways that writers came up with to connect all 4 of the Star Trek franchises that existed at the time. One of those was one of the books that I want to talk about today. The Klingons from The Next Generation have the Day of Honor. It's a day where they reflect on their Klingon heritage. And once we had Star Trek, the original show, The Next Generation, Star Trek Deep Space Nine, and Star Trek Voyager, then all of a sudden writers thought, well, there's a Klingon connection with all 4 of those. Why don't we do that? And the book is called The Way of the Warrior. That is also the title of a fantastic 2-part Star Trek Deep Space Nine episode. And the novel, particularly enough, is written by Diane Carey. Both of these are. She's the one who turns in really outstanding Star Trek fiction. And she did a novelization of The Way of the Warrior based on a long amount, a stack of stuff from Deep Space Nine. But she does it really well. And of course, the hallmark of Star Trek fiction, something I learned again during my Thanksgiving weekend, during my Thanksgiving break. I reread a couple of Alan Dean Foster's novelizations of individual cartoon episodes of Star Trek, and they're terrific, absolutely terrific. The hallmark of a really good Star Trek novel that adapts screenplays will be what it adds, not how faithfully it adapts the screenplay. That's why, although I'll always honor James Blish for adapting the original shows, I really wish that Paramount would allow that to be done again. I really wish that Paramount would say, we're going to do a separate novel for each of the original Star Trek shows. We're going to conscript writers to do this, and that's going to be the novelization of these shows. I really wish they would do that, because it takes a bit of skill to take, in this case, a 40-minute teleplay and pad it out into a novel. But if you find a skillful writer, then that can be done. And this Way of the Warrior is all about Worf's Klingon heritage, which is extremely fraught. His family is honorable, but the shifting tides of Klingon politics make it an outcast family, make him an outcast. And he's a bit of an outcast anyway, because he grew up on Earth. His parents tried to simulate his Klingon upbringing, but they themselves were humans. There's an episode of The Next Generation where we meet them, and they are as human gets. They are not Klingon wannabes. They were just trying to do right by their little boy. And Diane Carey does a fantastic job with this book. And there's a passage that I want to read you that she adds to the script and does a great job, because Worf is talking to Benjamin Sisko about his human parents. And Sisko says, I understand the human couple who adopted you tried to raise you in some semblance of Klingon ways. Is that right? I'm not going to try to imitate Avery Brooks's particular way of speaking English. I don't think anyone's ever duplicated it. I don't think anyone's ever understood it. I think it's defied medical science. I'm not going to try to imitate it. And Worf says, they tried. He hesitates on the word tried. Well, I think they made a mistake. What's it given you but a struggle? It was a disservice to you as an individual to try to make you part of a group you just weren't part of. Worf stared at him. Never in his life had he heard anything like that statement. As a child, he had been teased, of course, but children tease. As an adult, he had been given only approving nods when people heard that his parents had tried to raise him in what they thought was the Klingon way. Now he was hearing something wildly else. And then Benjamin Sisko goes on. This passage is classic Diane Carey. Klingons can't always have been warriors, Sisko went on, without apology for what he had said about Worf's parents. A warrior mentality is the luxury of success. The fighting habit can't be instinct, or there wouldn't be Klingons. You'd have all killed each other a long time ago, or just died out because nobody bothered to grow food or build shelter. A martial culture that desires more than anything to live and die in battle is just not going to survive. Somebody has to deal with the mundane. Somebody has to grow food. Somebody has to make clothing. If your whole culture's fighting, you'd better be able to steal those things from someone else. If you don't do that, you die. If you run up on a group of tough farmers or weavers, you die, like the Vikings of old Earth. To them, the only way to make it to Valhalla in the next life was to die in battle. So they could only survive as long as they could steal from others. Eventually, others just started saying no and figured out ways to outsmart the power of raw strength. In case you hadn't noticed, the Vikings didn't make it into modern civilization. Technology, Worf murmured hoarsely. Shame brought heat to his cheeks. That is what you are talking about. The Klingons did not develop spacefaring. We stole it from others who landed on our planet. Then we came out into the galaxy and stole more. Folding his arms and leaning against the viewport's rim, Sisko shook his head. Your ancestors, Mr. Worf. Somebody else. Complete strangers. Not you. That's my point. And this book deals, I recommend it. You might look at it. In fact, I'll recommend it because of what it looks like. Because it says, a novel by Diane Carey based on The Way of the Warrior, written by Ian Stephen Bear and Robert Hewitt Wolfe. And that description would make you think that this is something you need to know a lot about in order to read. That it's just an adaptation of a screenplay. And that if you don't know it, you won't get the book. And that's not true. Diane Carey is much better than that. So I do recommend this book. I also recommend Way of the Warrior. If you've got Star Trek on Netflix, I know because I saw a huge amount of it when my hosts were touring through Netflix on Thanksgiving. Deep Space Nine is entirely on Netflix, so The Way of the Warrior is on Netflix, and it's terrific viewing. And then another development that I want to mention with Deep Space Nine is connected with the other book that I want to talk about today, and that is that elephant in the room, the thing that I mentioned 20 minutes ago and haven't mentioned since, the wormhole. There's a stable wormhole to another part of the galaxy, a part of the galaxy where the Federation does not reach, where the Klingons and Romulans do not reach, where they're barely ever seen or explored. Late in Deep Space Nine, the writers thought, well, there'd be superpowers, there'd be empires, and militaristic or otherwise, there'd be groups, there'd be polities in that other quadrant, and they have a wormhole too. It extends. One end of it is in their end of space. What would happen, the writers thought, if the biggest and baddest group, empire, superpower, in that quadrant decided to use the wormhole to conquer the Alpha Quadrant, the quadrant where all of Star Trek takes place? And that's what they did. They invented a thing called the Dominion, a vast militaristic empire ruled by the founders, who, it turns out, in the course of Deep Space Nine, are shapeshifters, the exact same species as Deep Space Nine's security constable, Odo. It turns out the founders seeded the Alpha Quadrant with, members of their own species who often didn't remember much. This causes great episodes because Odo becomes the center of everything for Starfleet and for Deep Space Nine, and for himself. He becomes utterly conflicted as a Star Trek character because he is a member of the leader of the leaders of the Dominion, who, it becomes clear, want to conquer the Alpha Quadrant and begin using the wormhole to do that, to bring forward troops, including the Jem'Hadar, biologically created super soldiers who don't eat, they don't drink, they live only for a few years, and they live on a drug, Tetracell White. And that's what keeps them going. And they are incredibly tough, tougher than Klingons. Bless its heart, Deep Space Nine embraced the idea. What would happen if Star Trek went to war? Not if Star Trek mentioned a war, or if there was fighting off stage, but what would happen if the Star Trek show you're watching was a war show instead of an exploration show? I had my doubts when they started, and they did a fantastic job. The Dominion episodes of Deep Space Nine are the best episodes of Deep Space Nine by far. And the whole arc of the Dominion War, from the its tentative beginnings all the way to the end, encompasses every kind of Star Trek show that you could possibly have except exploration. Even there, they get in their way. There's incredible emotional payoff, incredible action sequences, incredible epic storytelling. It is the ultimate payoff of what Deep Space Nine decided to give to viewers, which is Federation history in the making. Because every Star Trek fan's ultimate dream comes true in the course of the Dominion War. Because if a massive entity, empire, whatever you want to call it, attacks the Alpha Quadrant with the goal of subjugating it completely and making slaves of all of its peoples, then the Star Trek storyline that flows naturally from that, although the showrunners and writers of Deep Space Nine take their sweet time getting there beautifully to tease the readers, the natural storyline is that all of a sudden all of the enemies of Star Trek will unite to save themselves. In other words, you will get Star Trek episodes in which the Romulans, the Klingons, and the Federation are all on the same side. And those of you who are all longtime Star Trek fans will probably be bouncing in your seat right now because you wanted that as badly as I did, and it was done perfectly. And one of the books, there was a series of books that eventually Paramount decided to do, and that was use books to tell the Dominion War in book form. And the book that I'm talking about today is Dominion War Book 2, also written by Diane Carey. They looked like this, and they had step backs. Very rare for Star Trek novels to have step back art, they were stills from the show. Only I don't know if you can make it out in this light. Sort of airbrushed, so they're not quite photographs. I think this is a missed opportunity. It's a really good book. I highly recommend it, but I think it's a missed opportunity. And I'm hoping that somewhere down the line, it seems unlikely at this point, but I would love it if somebody actually wrote a novel. One person wrote a novel of the Dominion War. The books here are written by a whole bunch of different people based on episodes that were written by a whole bunch of other different people. I would love to see the story of the Dominion War told from start to finish by one science fiction author. But I'll take this in the meantime, because this is really good. And there's a moment here during the fluctuating tides of war. At one point, the Cardassians retake Deep Space Nine, and their leader, Gul Dukat, they're one of their military generals, is occupying Ben Sisko's office, which had to be evacuated very quickly as the Cardassians take over. So quickly that Benjamin Sisko leaves behind his heirloom baseball, which was decorating his desk. And there's a moment here that Diane Carey adds where Gul Dukat is reflecting on that. And it's, again, Diane Carey perfectly done. The Federation had put up a massive resistance since the taking of Deep Space Nine, but since then things had tapered off to a series of bluntly controlled actions which neither gained nor lost much for either side, and that was, in Dukat's mind, suspicious. Even now, after 2 months, he felt the constant presence of Ben Sisko, as if the air were painted with the captain's face. The baseball? Dukat had actually tried several times to muster the will to throw the thing away, but there was something cloying about it, something that kept him from becoming too complacent, and he knew in his soldier's mind that that little ball was doing him a great service. These people from Earth, in particular, were bewildering. Unlike the Klingons, the Vulcans, the Cardassians, or the Dominion, the people from Earth seemed to have no particular strengths, no special talents, little unity of purpose or thought or opinion, yet they seemed continually to be the axis of history. Strange and disturbing, those people. And Diane Carey stresses that throughout all of her Star Trek fiction in any iteration of the show. She tries to get at the uniqueness of humans, why they would be at the center of so much of an intergalactic, an interplanetary collection of peoples. I mean, she does a wonderful job. Her characterization in this book of Gul Dukat is one of the highlights of the book. And he's a great character in general in Deep Space Nine, again, because the writers contoured him that way once they realized they had a fantastic actor to play him. Same thing with the Klingon General Martok. Could have been just another cardboard cutout Klingon, but the writers realized what the actor could do and gave him fantastic moments, fantastic scenes. And this, again, is a hideously long video, so we're going to wrap it up. That basically does it for the books that I want to connect with Deep Space Nine. And next time, in Boldly GoVember, we will move on to Star Trek Voyager, which is an entirely different kind of story, having only one thing in common with Deep Space Nine at the beginning, and that is that it also pushed the boundaries. It also pushed the envelope of what a normal Star Trek show could be. And we'll talk all about that at nauseating length tomorrow. Until then, I'm gonna wrap this up, and I will see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.